On the evening of the 26th of May, 1941, a sailor on the deck of the battleship Bismarck looked up at a grey, exhausted sky, and for the first time in days, he let himself feel safe. He had reason to. 2 days earlier, his ship had blown apart HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, in under 10 minutes. 1,400 British sailors went down with her. 3 came back. The German crew were almost home. Occupied France was a single day away. What he could not see was that the British had found his ship. Out of that same grey sky, a single aircraft was already turning toward her, and it did not look like a weapon. It looked like a joke. A biplane, cloth and wire, an open cockpit, wheels that did not even fold away. Something the Royal Navy should have retired years before. Which leaves 2 questions the history books have never been comfortable answering. The first, why in 1941 was Britain throwing fabric biplanes at the most modern battleship ever built? What had gone so badly wrong that the cutting edge of Royal Navy air power was an aircraft that was already obsolete before the war had even started? The second question is stranger, and it reaches all the way around the world. Because months before the Bismarck, this same obsolete biplane had done something on one quiet night in the Mediterranean that a handful of Japanese naval officers studied with enormous care, and what they took from it, they carried home. Almost exactly 6 months after the Bismarck went down, the lesson of this small British biplane would be written across the floor of Pearl Harbor in the wreckage of the United States Pacific Fleet. This is the story of the Fairey Swordfish, the aircraft the whole world wrote off, and how being obsolete turned out to be the single most dangerous thing about it. To understand how Britain ended up here, you have to understand one quiet disaster. Between the wars, British naval aviation was starved, while every rival poured money into fast, modern aircraft. By the time the next war came, the Royal Navy's frontline torpedo bomber was a full generation behind. It rode off the production line in 1936, and it was the Fairey Swordfish. It was a biplane in an age of monoplanes. Its body was metal frame and fabric. The 3-man crew sat in the open air, exposed to the weather. The undercarriage was fixed, hanging in the wind. Flat out, with nothing under it, it could manage about 140 miles an hour. With a torpedo slung beneath it, far less. The crews gave it a name that said everything. They called it the string bag, after the cheap string shopping bags of the day, because like those bags, it seemed able to carry absolutely anything. By every measure navies used to judge an aircraft, it was finished before it began. The Americans and the Japanese were already building sleek, modern monoplanes. Everyone who looked at the Swordfish drew the same conclusion. In a real war, it would be slaughtered. Except it would not be. Within a year, this museum piece would cripple half of an enemy battle fleet in a single night and begin rewriting the rules of war at sea. But that comes later. First, you have to meet the ship it was built to kill. The Bismarck was not just another warship. She was the proudest vessel in Hitler's navy. Nearly 3 football fields long, armor belts over a foot thick, guns that could throw a shell the weight of a small car for nearly 20 miles. When she sank the Hood, she did not just win a battle. She announced that she could not be stopped. So this was the matchup. The most modern battleship in the world, against an aircraft that belonged in a museum. Except the Swordfish had already done something nobody thought possible. And to see why it was so dangerous, you have to go back 6 months, to a harbour in southern Italy. On the night of the 11th of November 1940, 21 Swordfish took off from the carrier HMS Illustrious and flew through the dark toward the Italian fleet, anchored safely in the port of Taranto. The harbor was shallow, so shallow that an air-dropped torpedo should have simply buried itself in the mud. The British had quietly solved that problem, modifying their torpedoes to run in shallow water. The Italians had no idea it was coming. In a single night, those obsolete biplanes crippled 3 Italian battleships, half of Italy's battle fleet put out of action in one raid. The cost to the British was 2 aircraft. It had never been done before. For the first time in history, aircraft flying from a carrier had reached out and broken a battle fleet at anchor. Taranto was the night the battleship stopped being the master of the sea, and the men who studied it most closely were not in London. They were in Tokyo. But hold that thought, because here is the part that matters most, and it is the heart of this whole story. The Swordfish could do these things not in spite of being obsolete, but because of it. A slow aircraft can fly in weather that would tear a fast one apart. It can take off and land on a heaving deck in a storm. It can crawl in at wave-top height, in the dark, under the enemy's guns, and line up a torpedo with patience, because it was never built for speed in the first place. Everything that made the Swordfish a joke on paper made it deadly in the one job that actually mattered. The world had laughed at the wrong aircraft. Which brings us back to the Atlantic and the hunt for the Bismarck. After she sank the hood on the 24th of May, the Bismarck did the most frightening thing she could have done. She disappeared. For roughly 31 hours, the Royal Navy lost her completely, and every one of those hours carried her closer to occupied France, to the protection of German air cover and German submarines, where she could be repaired and sent out to do it all again. At the Admiralty, this was no longer a hunt. It was a race they were losing. A flying boat finally spotted her far to the south, almost within reach of safety. But the only British force close enough to do anything was Force H and its carrier, HMS Ark Royal. And the weather was a full Atlantic gale. The flight deck was pitching up and down by tens of feet. The sea was the kind of sea in which no modern aircraft could possibly take off and live. But the Swordfish was not a modern aircraft. Its stall speed was so absurdly low that it could claw off a deck and back onto it, in conditions that would have killed anything faster. So they flew. The first strike failed. They rearmed and went out again into the dark. The second strike, 15 Swordfish, found the Bismarck at dusk, in the teeth of the storm. The battleship threw up a wall of fire. The biplanes came in low and slow through it, one after another, and dropped their torpedoes. Most missed. One did not. It struck the stern. It jammed the rudder at an angle of about 12 degrees and locked it there. And in that instant, the most powerful warship afloat lost the one thing she could not do without. She could no longer steer. She could only turn in a wide, helpless circle, unable to run, unable to escape, drifting back toward the enemy through the night. By morning, the British battleships had caught up. On the 27th of May, 1941, they closed in and finished her. More than 2,000 German sailors died with the ship. The Swordfish did not sink the Bismarck. The guns of the fleet did that. But it was the biplane that caught her. Without that one torpedo, in that one impossible place, the Bismarck reaches France. The aircraft everyone had written off was the reason the most dangerous ship in the world never made it home. After the Bismarck, the navies of the world all drew the same conclusion. The battleship, the symbol of national power for half a century, could be crippled by aircraft costing a tiny fraction of its price. The future of war at sea belonged to the carrier and the torpedo plane. Everyone understood it now. But one navy had understood it first, and it had already begun to act. Go back to Taranto, and to those officers in Tokyo. Japanese naval planners studied that one night in extraordinary detail, the proof that carrier aircraft could destroy a battle fleet sitting at anchor. The trick of the shallow water torpedo in a harbor everyone had assumed was too shallow to attack. These were not abstractions to them. They were a blueprint. On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, the Japanese Navy did to the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor what the Swordfish had first proved was possible at Taranto: a surprise strike launched from carriers against battleships moored in shallow water and certain they were safe. The technique that a slow British biplane had pioneered now lay at the bottom of Pearl Harbor along the length of Battleship Row. And here is the last irony of all. The Swordfish was supposed to be replaced. A newer aircraft was built to retire it, and that successor turned out to be worse at the job and was quietly withdrawn before the Swordfish was. So the obsolete biplane simply kept flying. It flew and fought until the very end of the war in 1945. The aircraft everyone had laughed at outlived the machine that was built to replace it. And the sailor on the deck of the Bismarck, the one who laughed. He had been right about every single thing. The biplane was slow. It was fragile. It was, by any sane measure, obsolete. He had simply failed to understand that on that grey evening in those seas, against that ship, obsolete was exactly the point.